So thank you, Ag, and thanks you guys for coming. It's really great to be here, and I want to kind of start this with a little more elaboration on who I am. That I'm not quite a librarian, nor am I a computer scientist, but I land somewhere in between, and I think that's a good way to approach what I'm going to talk about today. And I want to ask everyone in this room, I assume everyone makes maps on occasion, are you a data curator? And if you had asked me this about 4 years ago, I would have said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so now I want to share kind of an experience that I had in data curation and what that now means to me, and how the libraries have influenced that. And I'm going to do it in the context of this project, which is, not moving forwards, there we go. It's a large science project that had over 30 researchers involved. It was funded by both NOAA and the NCCOS. It went from 2011 to 2018. They had 4 years of research of data gathering and then about 3 years of synthesis. It was hugely interdisciplinary. It involved biology, physical oceanography, genetics, economics, and so on. And right at the outset, NOAA was very interested in data curation, and they came to the 3 principal investigators on this project, and they said, you know, we want you to have a data curation component in your research. And this is how the Center for Computational Science got brought on at the University of Miami, was that they were invited to do this data curation component of the project, and they were also invited to build what they called a decision support resource. And I came to understand this as online mapping. And so this is kind of the context of what's going on. Although the project is now over, in other words, the funding is gone, we are still working on this, and I'll get back to that in a minute as to why that's taking place. And I'm talking about the curation and this online mapping. So this is what I want to talk about today. I want to give it some context of the project goals. I want to talk about some work and some data flows, and then kind of show you what happened and reflect on it a little bit. And I will warn you that I've never done a show and tell quite like this before, but I'm very curious to see how it goes. So at the outset, the goals were pretty simple for this project. It was all about taking care of this data, and then it had these kind of 2 overarching goals that were going on beyond that. One was to encourage this synthesis, and it was largely to give the researchers a place where they could go and look at someone else's data. Like someone from physical oceanography could go look at the genetics data and see if they could make a connection or something like that. This was the idea behind it. Very lofty goal. I'm not quite sure we made it. And then the other one was to build this decision report or this support resource to share kind of the results in a tangible way with the decision makers, and read that as politicians and resource managers and the general public. And I think there's 2 things to note about these project goals. I was brought on after this. Who here knows what I'm talking about? The Office of Science and Technology Policy Memo 2013. Okay, so this is super important. This is when the federal government suddenly said all federally funded research must be made available to the general public, both the articles and the data. And this was a huge moment, and I was brought on, interestingly enough, after this. This is when all of a sudden they were like, we need some more help doing this. I also want to point out that these goals, and the project was designed without a geographer and without a cartographer. There were lots of other people involved, but no geographers, cartographers, nor librarians. So I got brought in kind of as last minute. They're like, we need one of these. And I kind of fit the bill as this middle thing. Whoops. So I'm going to talk about curation, and this is how I came to see it for this project. And you'll notice that it kind of goes into 2 components. You have the research on the bottom left producing the data, and then that data gets split out. And you have this idea that you're creating metadata, that's a kind of a iterative cycle over there. And then in our case, we chose to represent both the metadata and the data in JSON and throw that into a Solr indexing engine. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. The data, it didn't matter what format it was. We would just squish that into some kind of GeoJSON. If it didn't have geographic coordinates, it just squished into JSON. And then the metadata creation was very interesting, that we were involved with both NOAA and the National Center for Environmental Information. And we started with a very basic Dublin core metadata set. For those of you who don't know what that is, that means that we're starting with really basic elements, with the author, the title, the when it was made, the kind of stuff like this, really basic descriptive elements. And then we started adding things on. And as geographers know, and as GIS people know, the metadata kind of set for geographic information is this enormous thing with hundreds of fields. And so we didn't want to start out with that, and we ended up building our own custom one. And I'm starting to realize this is actually a very good way to approach curation for a project. You want to kind of pick and choose the ones you need, and then go from there. And I think that process was really interesting. I want to kind of pointed out as one of the successes of this is that through that collaboration, the researchers learned a ton and will do a much better job of curating their data next time, right? It was really interesting. I learned a ton as well, and I think also the people at NCEI learned a ton. And then for a moment on solar, for those of us who don't know what solar comes out of the Apache Foundation. The Apache Foundation produces open source software. Their most famous product is perhaps their HTTP server, which runs a large portion of the internet. The Lucene solar technology is search engine technology, and we use it all the time. When you go onto Amazon, I would be willing to bet hundreds of dollars that they're using the solar indexing technology to go through their catalog and provide you with search results when you're looking for something on Amazon. Libraries also have a history of using the solar Lucene search technology for things like, I'm pretty sure, I don't know, it's not called Hydra anymore, but I think Hydra was built on a solar search engine as well, which is the community-funded kind of repository software that's been built. And then I want to talk a little bit about how it actually functions. So that was kind of our process, our workflow, but this is how we actually built this tool. So we ended up deciding to build our own tool instead of going with something that was pre-built. And the reason we did this is because I was working with a bunch of computer engineers who have research money. And they were like, no, we want to reinvent the wheel. And so they had this very beginner's mind. I heard this term yesterday and I really appreciated it. They had this beginner's mind approach to creating a repository and to drawing maps. While it's sometimes very refreshing, it was also sometimes very frustrating. But it was very interesting. And we ended up choosing this stack to work with. Very basically, you have the front end, which is where the person's using your repository. It sends a request to the web server, which goes to a little stack of software there, and it goes to find in that index what they're actually looking for. And as a way of kind of looking at this, this is the site we ended up producing, and you'll notice it has it's actually kind of hard to see. Let me see if I can, there we go. Make it bigger. So the middle two are this interactive map. That's the decision support resource. And the one on the right is the discover and download data. This is more of the repository that got built in the end. And as you can see, we ended up curating about 28 data sets. We got a nice set of metadata. It's very interesting. And through this technology they built, and you'll notice the Amazon-esque kind of things on the left there where you can filter things. But I can easily search for some kind of family name it's a family of corals, and it shows, so you can filter out data sets really easily and find what you're looking for. So I remember the idea was a researcher could come here and find it. You can see what's going on, if it's been released or if it's pending, or what's going on. Once you get down to the data set you're interested in, we have several other tools. You can go to a download if it has been released. You'll note this goes to another repository. So our repository points to other repositories. That's not a problem for me. This is where the data actually is going to reside and be taken care of. We don't want to take that on at the Center for Computational Science. We'd much rather slough that off to an organization that is actually taking care of data, and that's their job. So we simply built a tool to get to that. Whoops, bear with me here. Actually, I want this one back. And you can actually, we built these little citation tools. So this is part of the idea that data is a publication as well. And you can download the citation, put it in your favorite manager, or you can just copy and paste it. And I think this was really interesting, and I'll come back to it later, but I think the curation of the metadata went very well. The curation of the data did not. And it kind of splits out, and I'll talk to that a little bit more in a moment when I come to some of the caveats of what's going on. So I want to go back to this now and talk a little bit about the Data Explorer. And this has a two-step process of what's going on. So it uses the full mean stack, where it's going into this MongoDB NoSQL data store to get the story. And you'll see what I mean. We ended up building a story map viewer basically from scratch, which was very interesting in some ways. And then the second step of this is that, actually I'll show you the first step first, because it's kind of interesting. So we'll go back to Pulley Ridge, and you'll see that I can go to the interactive map, and we have 4 stories. Well, I didn't want to go to that one actually. I wanted to go to the bioeconomics one. And you'll see it brings up a number of slides at the bottom, much like a standard kind of one of the ways of doing a story map is having slides at the bottom. You can click and choose things. And what it does, so it went and got that story information from Mongo. And then when it comes back to that second step, it's going to go and get the actual geographic features from that layer feature index that we built. And that returns GeoJSON from Solr. And so here, I'm just going to do a really quick kind of overview of what you can do. We built several one-off tools, and I'll get to this in a minute, that you can actually animate time series data. Whoops. You can get attribute information from what's going on. So we're looking at fishing days in these regions. You can actually, in real time, switch and filter the data you're looking at. So now we're just looking at data that's long line for that. We ended up building also a very nice way of looking at charts that was interactive, so you can kind of quickly look through the data and find different stories very easily. And you'll see that, that the stories are remarkably different. And one of the things that came out of this was that the researchers had never seen their data in this way before. They'd never have anyone look through their data in this way before, and they'd never seen it this way before. And they had a lot of fun playing with this. There were about 3 researchers involved in this, plus their graduate students on this story. So it's a collaborative story in itself. And they found this rather fascinating. And I think it's really cool that, you know, this was a separate research project, but once again, you can kind of look at it together. Once again, you can see things that are going on. You can see certain geographic information or geographic relationships that are going on. That mostly this is grouper up north, and it's going to those counties. The economic benefits go to those counties, or you can look at other patterns. And of course, what was really interesting about this, I really enjoyed this part because I love doing online interactive maps. But when we showed the researchers this, and they could filter by species and just see that species story, they were much more excited about this, which is kind of interesting, you know, that this is perhaps a better way to tell the story. So in a certain sense, I was very happy with the way a lot of this came out, and I think a lot of the team was very happy with the way this came out, but I want to talk for a moment about some of the caveats of what came out, and we can actually see it by going to the last slide in this story and look at the text right here. So we had serious issues with data sharing, and I think this was mentioned a little bit in the plenary as well, that even under mandate, researchers are very hesitant to share their data. And I think it was mentioned, it's very correct, that, you know, they're scared of the scoop, they're scared of being exposed perhaps, and they're also, they have a fear of misuse, that it's going to get used in the wrong way. And so when you look at actually what's in here, I said we have a very good collection of metadata, but if I take off this cavernosa filter, you'll notice that nothing changed. There's one data set that's been released. So this is why it's kind of still in progress and why some of those stories haven't been done yet. But if I go back and look at this, you see that we are in process. We have 7 data sets in review, and we have 7 that are submitted, but they're not all released. So in general, it's working towards that. As the academics get their publications out, the data is coming in. And so we look forward to telling more stories, but that brings me to another one of the caveats of this, was that when you go to the stories, who do you think made that story? You know, they've published their article, they're done. I read their articles, they were super interesting. I started getting some ideas together about how I might do this, and I ended up making this story. And they weren't upset with that, but it really drew attention to the fact that they don't have time to do this. And that once the publication is done, they have little interest in doing this. And I think it actually is a great opportunity for people like me who like to draw maps to go and help people synthesize data in these large science projects as these become more popular, and I think they will. So I think there's a great opportunity there. In fact, I'm going to skip to my, I'm going to do the classic thing here. So I did want to just say that we had other issues. It's not very discoverable. We didn't have an API for search engines to find anything here. Problem. Map systems versus cartography. I lean towards cartography. We should draw maps, not create systems. And then I was just speaking about who synthesizes and tells. And then the last thing for the librarians in the audience, I really want to start a conversation about research projects as special collections. So in our library, there's a conversation about collections as data, special collections as data. I want to flip that on its head and say, no, data are special collections, and start talking about data in this form. And the way I want to close this is that, you know, it was an awesome learning experience, and I think the greatest thing I learned is that all cartographers are data curators, and there's a lot of really cool data curation experience in the library, and I think that collaboration is really a good one. And then the other one was that even though we failed on several levels, there was absolutely no time lost in doing this. It was a really awesome project, so thank you. Nathan has one.
It seems clear that once somebody gets to this resource, they'll be blown away. Right? I mean, this was fantastic. My question is, how do people find the resource?
So this is exactly what I was talking about. Thank you for that question. That's a really good question. So I don't know if everyone understands what these two terms mean. So the OAI PMH is the Open Access Initiative Protocol for Metadata Harvesting. So we have this great curated collection of metadata, but there's no way for Google to see it. And there actually are tools that you can build into that technology stack so that we could expose our metadata so that search engines could find it. And I think that would be one of the best ways. And actually through that protocol, you can create what are called these resource description framework triples, which goes into the whole open linked data conversation. And I think it was one of our huge oversights was not to plan that in at the beginning. So great question. Okay. Go ahead.